in the early 2000s, you predicted the continuing economic growth of China.
Yeah,
And that's
I have a 20 plus year prediction going about economic growth rates in China and what's likely to happen, the knock on consequences for, say, US national security, geopolitics. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of amazing that, roughly speaking, my projections going back 15, 20 years have largely been correct. And so now I have more projections for the future that we could talk about if you want to go that direction.
what kind of projections would you see from here on out?
Well, I think the starting point. So I think by now, even 5 or 10 years ago, when we were kind of locked up in this phony war on terror and focused on somewhat irrelevant things happening, in Afghanistan and the Middle East, and meanwhile China was growing stronger and stronger. By now, people who think about national security and geopolitics are pretty focused on China. So the idea that China is going to be a peer competitor. It's probably significantly less fragile than some of the war hawks in the United States would like to think. It has tremendous human capital base. It has a very high functioning technological and scientific research establishment. I think those are pretty well known things now. I think the part that being a Chinese American and having grown up in an era, a very different cultural era in America, I kind of grew up in the 80s. I have been anticipating this. If you sort of fast forward, you think, okay, when Japan became prominent, it was already a problem for white people, Europeans, to think that, okay, this other race of people are going to compete with us on even terms and actually maybe threaten us.
Yeah.
There was a reaction, but that reaction was a tiny fraction of the reaction that's going to happen when, for example, China becomes, say, the largest economy in the world or predominant, at least in its sphere of influence in Asia. I think the psychological ramifications and the culture clash between what is still a very Eurocentric view of the world, Western civilization, and a confrontation with this very old civilization, which has a totally different view of itself and of history than the West. I think that that whole frame of reference is still sort of underappreciated right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had the exact same thought. I mean, Japan, I mean, it was rising, but it would never had the population to become the biggest country in the world, the biggest economy in the world. And, economic growth just sort of stopped at some point. I don't, they had populate, I think they had a population problem, and sort of the returns to that started affecting them pretty early on. But, Japan had, we classify countries into, two camps, democracy and non-democracy. So the fact that Japan had the, something of what we think of as the American system, although obviously it's a much different system, sort of in our minds, it was, somehow not alien or somehow friendly. And we still, the country, I'm too young to remember this, but from what I read, people were really freaking out about Japan in the late 80s and early 90s.
Yes.
So
So
you're right.
I
Yeah.
lived through that era where there was a famous book, I think maybe by Ezra Vogel at Harvard, Japan as Number One, where they made these crazy economic projections saying that Japan was actually this country with, half or a third the population of the United States was going to be the leading economic power. And so there was a frenzy, and there were actually things, very parallel to what recently has been done to Huawei was probably done to Toshiba and other Japanese companies around that time. But the thing I would like to point your listeners to, if they're interested in what my prediction is for, what this U.S.-China relationship or confrontation is going to be like, I would suggest to read a book by an MIT historian called John Dower. And the title of that book is called War Without Mercy. And in that book, he studies the Pacific War in World War II in great detail and compares it to the war, say, between the United States and the campaign in Western Europe after Normandy, and the level of ferocity and brutality when Europeans were fighting Asians was just at a totally different level from both sides than what was seen, at least in Western Europe. Now, maybe between the Nazis and the Soviet Union, there was something obviously very ferocious going on there as well.
Mm.
But I think people don't realize, all Asians know this, I think, at a very deep level. They know that the West would like to keep them down. The West is used to being on top and wants to stay on top, and really would like to keep whichever civilization in Asia, East Asia, is rising, would like to keep them down. And I think almost all Asians just appreciate, even South Asians appreciate this kind of very intuitively. But Europeans can't generally let it creep into their consciousness.
Yeah. I mean, do you think that perhaps, I mean, this is one thing that I wonder about. I agree with you on the fundamentals of China being strong, and it has the population, it has deep, societal strengths, including a high human capital. And so there's, I wrote a paper called the Inevitable Triumph of China, or something like that. I forget the exact title. But the idea that China is going to become the largest economy in the world, I think that's pretty much baked in. And you would have to have some kind of black swan event for that not to be the case. Um, but are we sort of just, I mean, is our capacity for delusion infinite? I mean, I think we might not be the same. It seems like we're less connected to reality than we were when Japan was rising 30 years ago. So, like, for example, I mean, you shouldn't get your information on how Americans are thinking just from like Twitter responses. But I look at like the people who are experts in like foreign policy, they don't see much better. Like, you put up any metric of like how well China's doing, people say, how can you believe the Chinese Communist Party? You could tell them anything. You could say China has fewer COVID deaths. How do you know that? So it seems like, we are very, very able to sort of be smugly satisfied, with who we are compared to a country like China. As much as we hate each other and we have our domestic politics, I see Americans sort of, with just an incredible capacity to just continue believing what they want to believe. Is there anything that's going to sort of knock us out of that stupor?
It's possible that for the majority of Americans left to their own devices, and even the majority of academics left to their own devices, they could stay in that blissful unreality for a long time. But you also have a whole population of people whose job is to look at tail risks and to look at threats from other countries. So this whole national security establishment now is very much engaged in ginning up a kind of anti-China narrative and really emphasizing the threats from China. And of course, it dovetails nicely with their self-interest, because the military industrial complex would love to have a good enemy to point to,
Mhm.
and they can build some wonderful systems, hypersonic weapons at $1 billion a shot. So all of this, I think, is going to self-reinforce toward. I'm afraid we will end up in a Cold War, even though most Americans probably don't have any strong reason to fear or despise, the Communist Party of China.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think the same thing too. So yeah, I mean, that's the theme of my book. That basically the threat perception adjusts to the reality based on what can sell and what can basically keep keep things as they are, and we keep funding the military, giving these people power, giving these people a sense of self importance. That's my model of the world too. So they have an interest and an ideological and a material interest for sort of ginning up a lot of anti-China stuff, but still, I think they have a little bit harder time. I don't think it's as easy to sell, the country on a new Cold War as it used to be. So we had something, we had 9/11, right? And this was just, the biggest story in the world. So, 3,000 Americans die, they got a good 10, 20 years of wars out of that, you know, and then like today, it seems like we're so divided. It's like, if one side like becomes very anti-China, it's like the other side will be not want to be so anti-China. So you find that with Russia, like liberals really hate Russia now. They blame them for Trump. And so like conservatives are a little bit, they have a hard time getting mad at Russia. And it seems like conservatives are really going all in on China. And sometimes they go all in on China just like as a way to own the libs. They'll say, why do they focus on Russia when China is the real threat? But I noticed, like, even though elite Democratic, the top levels of the Democratic Party, tend to take a tougher line on China, their heart just doesn't seem in it. And I feel like their heart isn't in it because conservatives are so anti-China. So are we
Yeah,
maybe a little bit too, divided and fragmented to really do anything like a Cold War without some, major event like 9/11?
yeah, that's a very interesting question. So the dynamic you just identified, I think, is for real. Although I have heard it said by many people that the one bipartisan issue in DC is anti-China
Yeah,
competition.
I've heard that too. Yeah.
So it's not clear which of those are going to win out. I want to say one thing though, just to clarify what I was saying about the national security state. If you're in a think tank or you're a military planner, you have to look at worst case scenario. So you have to look at, okay, this other country has 4 times our population. It might get to 2 times our GDP within our lifetimes. They're technologically advanced. So, in the worst case scenario, if they do want to be mean to us, we have to really worry about that tail risk. So, I don't want to criticize those people. I think there are people who are honestly sounding the alarm that the US basically stopped developing weapon systems that are appropriate for peer competition, focusing more on very expensive wars of occupation and pacification in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we are actually behind the Russians and the Chinese right now in many specific areas of conventional military technology. So I think those people are doing their job. It's their job to warn about risks in the future. What's different is then when the media get into it and the New York Times and the CIA starts to manipulate public opinion about how concerned we should be about China.
Yeah.
That extra step, I think, is a real problem. But I'm definitely not against people who are sounding the alarm that, hey, there's a peer competitor that we've kind of been ignoring for a while that we should at least think about. I think those people are completely right.